So today we're going to discuss about Center for Internet Security, CIS, as well as the 20 critical security controls that are actually put in place to secure an enterprise and get them to the next level of cybersecurity. So the first thing we're going to look at is actually what is Center for Internet Security. So the whole purpose of Center for Internet Security is actually to set a global standard and best practices for securing IT systems. And it's really important because if you start going through the granular details of it, you can actually do a lot of configurations of systems right down to the operating system level, as well as the services and applications, and then going through all of the people, process, and technology largely over on the technology end. So with all of these controls in place, you can secure your enterprise environment, product key data, especially from breaches, from cyber attacks, and that can really help you accelerate the whole pace of protecting end-to-end against potential advanced persistent threats. So this is really critical. And of course, another thing to really think about is, a key concept to think about is layer defense. So layer defense is going to be a key component as well in terms of recognizing how you can actually protect all of your environment, your enterprise environment, and CIS greatly reflect the ability for you to actually prove capabilities across layer of defenses against cyber threats. So of course, there are three key areas. Number one is the basic of the critical security controls. So the basic requirements is 6 bullet points here. So we got inventory and control of software, hardware, continuous vulnerability management, how do you scan vulnerabilities, get vulnerabilities in the environment and manage them consistently. And then you got control use of administrative privileges. That means what do you do with super users? What do you do with your key users? People who have a lot of power and control and could potentially cripple certain systems, who could take over and access critical financial data. And then you got secure configuration of hardware and software and mobile devices, laptops, workstation, servers. So if I look at point 1, inventory and control of software assets, point number 2, inventory and control of hardware assets, as well as point number 5, secure configuration of hardware and software and mobile devices, laptops, workstation, servers, there are actually quite a lot of overlapping capabilities. And finally is actually on maintenance, monitoring, and analysis of audit logs. So this is where security monitoring tools come into play. And right at the center, we're moving away from basic. We're going to the advanced foundational part. So over here, we have email and web browser protection. So again, you get a lot of phishing attacks. How do you stop them? And if there is a cross-site scripting in a web browser, how do you stop them? Again, these are key questions for you to ask. And we have malware defenses. So malware defenses, how do you use antivirus, endpoint detection response systems to actually be able to respond to advanced malware threats when user execute them, or even if it's exploitation of systems. And of course, we have limitation and control network ports, protocols, and services. So this is primarily on the network layer and how data and services should be transacting with each other, how data paths are supposed to be moving from one end to the other end. And we got data recovery capabilities, which is also key, especially when it's a disaster recovery. There's a disaster, there is a business continuity requirement where systems go down. How do you recover data? If data gets corrupted, how do you recover them? And of course, we have secure configuration for network devices such as firewalls, routers, and switches. Boundary defense usually is a way of actually protecting the intranet. And then you got data protection in terms of how you classify data management. And we got control access based on need to know. And finally, we got wireless access control. So wireless proliferation, how do you protect them? What is the right security encryption to use? And then finally, we got account monitoring control. So if you look over here on the foundation piece, again, if you look at item number 3, limitation control of network ports and protocols services, and so item number 5, secure configuration for network devices such as firewalls, routers, and switches, and point number 6, boundary defense. And if you look at these 3 points, it's primarily on the network layer. How do you want to protect them? How do you protect systems, sub-networks through usage of firewalls, network intrusion prevention systems, and many other configurations? And then if you look at the last point, which is account monitoring control, and then if you go back to basic again, you have the maintenance, monitoring, and analysis of audit logs. How do they gel together? Again, these are key concepts that may have some overlap, and you can actually use certain technology to actually gel a couple of these points together and be able to have a holistic defense for a couple of points. So the consolidation with a few platforms and less platforms are actually pretty important, because the less platforms you have, the less learning curve you got, the less chances of mistakes. So the best part is if you can consolidate all of the controls between the basic and foundational, then you have a wonderful and great capability to defend against advanced threats. And finally, on organization, so this has a huge focus outside of technology. It's a lot on people and process. So the very first point is actually about cybersecurity awareness and training program. How do you enable your users? How do you enable your users to identify what is considered as confidential data? What is considered as critical data? And point number 2 is application software security. So again, this may or may not apply to all organizations. For smaller organizations, they may not have in-house capability to develop those applications, yet at the same time they purchase software as a service, platform as a service, or applications and platforms. How do you protect them? And then of course you have incident response and management, which is a really key topic, one of the key topics in today's time, because a lot of large enterprises have spent so much money on basic foundational, which is on detection, prevention, and then now they're going to response, because they realize that despite all of the efforts, they still get compromised. So what do you do when you get compromised? And finally, putting your security controls, putting a security monitoring to the test is by putting in penetration testing as well as red team exercises to test your security configuration, to make sure that you left no stones unturned. So those are really key points. So all in all, zooming back out again, we got basic, foundational, as well as organization to actually be able to manage the critical security controls within your enterprise. So moving forward, we're going to go into the first, inventory and control of hardware assets. So what does it mean? So if you remember on some of the earlier tutorials, we were discussing about how you could actually gain complete control of the hardware asset. So if you could get your hands on a laptop, on a server, on a mobile device, you can actually use a USB, plug it into the machine, boot it up into your own operating system, and directly you can gain complete access into the device, and you can gain immediate access into all of the storage, whether it's confidential data, key data, and whatnot. So when it comes to this point, there's actually a lot of areas to think about, because controlling of hardware assets is actually very, very challenging the larger and larger your enterprise becomes. If you have 100,000 laptops to manage, what do you do? And then you have another 100,000 mobile devices where they have your bring your own device policy, and user accessing all this email content as well as sensitive data directly from their mobile phone, and then they save it into their own storage, and then they lose the phone, and then they lose the laptop. What do you do then? Can you enforce encryption? Can you be able to put password policies where if the storage is accessed, you actually have encryption on it, so you have a hardware device module that can actually help you do a lot of encryption, all those capabilities. So again, hardware asset is also a key capability, especially if you run data centers. So if you have data centers where you have hundreds and thousands of servers, what do you do when they go down? How do you actually inventorize them as well as control all of these hardware assets? So to the second point, we actually have inventory control of software assets. So here, what we can see is what are the software installed on top of your hardware. So what I mean by that is actually looking in terms of, let's say you have a laptop machine, and in the laptop, you have Adobe, you have Microsoft operating system, as well as Microsoft software like Office, Outlook, and then you got your browsers like Firefox and Chrome. So again, all these browsers, all this software on top of the operating system could actually introduce some kind of vulnerabilities, because they need to be patched, they need to be managed. Their accesses into the system has to be controlled. How do you control them? Can you enforce privilege access management for application? Can you ensure that applications do not need more accesses than they should have? And at the same time, if there is a zero-day vulnerability against a particular software, can you use other controls to actually mitigate through virtual patching? So again, if it is a machine, a laptop machine running on a Windows operating system, and then it has a vulnerable Firefox or Chrome, they open up an application, they open up a bad malicious link, immediately they're compromised, then what do you do from there? Can you manage the software patching of all these software assets across all of your hardware devices? Again, this is a key point to actually look out how you can control all these software assets. So one great example I can share with you is to have a platform that could be an agent base that could monitor across all your laptops, mobile devices, as well as servers. It could be a different platform for each of them. And what they do is they can track the software usage across all these systems, whether you're on servers, and in servers, they could be running on Linux, running on Windows servers, and so on. And then you must be able to see the software on top of the operating system and be able to patch them, be able to configure their access rights and the capabilities on it. Likewise for laptops, and a little more different for mobile devices, because mobile devices, you may want to use an enterprise mobility management technology or platform to actually do a containerization capability. So when I say containerization capability, what I mean is actually the ability to segregate enterprise and personal content so that all of the enterprise content is constantly being protected and then the personal content is left up to the user. So again, you can introduce this kind of capabilities. At the same time, you can, of course, introduce malware detection and then be able to flag out all these potential threats in the environment. So moving to the third control, we have continuous vulnerability management. So this is where you are constantly scanning from a outside in or inside out to be able to look at your software inventory, your operating systems, and be able to find out vulnerabilities. And vulnerabilities not just on your endpoints, but also in the switches, your servers, your databases, and find out whether there are vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities could be a potential exploit that then is tagged back into common vulnerability exposure database. And number two, it's also misconfiguration, because it could be a misconfiguration of a firewall. They open up a particular port number because there was a temporary project in place and then they forgot to remove them. Or there was a default username and password in one of the switch. Again, you want to check those out using vulnerability management. So one example I can give you immediately is using vulnerability scanners. That is constantly scanning the environment all the time, looking for misconfiguration, looking for potential common vulnerability exposure, and looking at how you can actually have remediation to patch those systems, to turn off certain firewall policies or turn on certain firewall policies. So all these are capabilities where you can utilize to have continuous vulnerability management. So the number 4 point is actually controlled use of administrative privileges. So this has been ramping up for the past 4 or 5 years. And what we're seeing is that privileged accounts like super users, endpoint administrators, server administrators, database administrators, they have a lot of power. And when they have a lot of power, they can actually directly access a lot of this sensitive data like financial data, personally identifiable information. So the whole idea is, can you have the ability to audit and to manage the use of administrative privileges? So one example I can give you is if a normal user accesses his machine and suddenly he gains privilege accesses, how do you manage and contain those accesses? And the next thing you want to look at is to make sure there's no disgruntled employees, especially super users, administrators. So you can actually use the concept of privilege access management and look at how you can use a jump host concept where users have to go through a vault in order to take credentials of a super user for temporal time and then accesses a particular server or switch to do some change configuration and then going back into the system again back to normal user privilege. So use of administrative privileges again is a highly looked at requirement for a lot of large enterprises to control and to contain the use of those privileges, accessing highly sensitive data. Item number 5, so we get secure configuration for hardware, software, and mobile devices, laptops, workstations, and servers. So if you think about how we were looking back earlier in the first couple of management on the software and hardware, so now it's about a lot on how can you access the configuration on top of the operating system, on top of the hardware and software. And from here, you want to look at whether you can distribute a lot of those policies. And when it comes to this kind of distribution of policies, we are thinking about policies like firewall management, password age, password complexity. Are you able to push out all this configuration across Windows, Macintosh, Android, iOS, as well as your servers like Win servers and Linux servers? So there are technology out there that can actually help you push down such capabilities so that there's continuous compliance, continuous configuration update, despite the kind of endpoints of laptops or workstation and servers they're using. Point number 6, so we can maintenance, monitoring, analysis of the logs. So again, this points back to one of the earlier lectures you saw in this channel. It's about security monitoring. So what happens is that whenever a event is triggered, whenever a access into a database is triggered, or if there is a de-authentication attack, if there is authentication failure, you want to lock all this down into a central place where you can keep all of this log information. So this is where you have your log management policy, where you can send logs like syslog of the event audits and then sending them all over into a central logging management system. And of course, the next step for a audit log system is actually a security monitoring platform, SIEM. So in an SIEM, what it does is that on top of the log, is constantly analyzing, could that be an attack in the environment? So if a laptop from the outside connects into the intranet and suddenly is doing a TCP hit, is scanning the environment for open up services or ports, immediately you can actually flag all those information out. And once it's flagged out, immediately you'll be able to look at the potential threats in the environment that this machine has been compromised, and you want to contain and remediate that particular device. So this is taking it to the next level by going to security monitoring platforms. So now we're on number 7. So it's on email and web browser protection. So if you saw on one of the early tutorials, we actually use browser exploitation framework to actually gain access into a web browser user, to push them out into other sites and force them to download executables like APK files or executables of BAT files, and the capabilities of web browser manipulations or cross-site scripting. All these are becoming more and more prevalent, and a lot of attacks are targeted specifically against web browsers. So this is another key area. Can you have a plugin onto your browser like Chrome or Firefox and be able to actually contain the scripts that's going to be executed within the browser? So some common scripts that attackers use are redirection. So redirection, can you limit the redirection capabilities? Can you stop them from opening up another application outside of the browser? And are you able to enforce cookie security? At the same time, for email protection, are you able to stop spam? Are you able to stop phishing attacks, whaling attacks, and so on? So again, you want to have email security embedded within your email servers so that any of these potential links that comes in are immediately dropped off and put as spam into the spam folder so that your users do not have the potential to click on them. Because the moment they click on them, if you saw on the earlier hacking tutorials, the moment they click on them, immediately they get exploited and all the confidential data will be fished out. So point number 8 is malware defenses. So malicious software is a huge part of cybersecurity. And what we recognize is that malicious software are getting more and more advanced and sophisticated. So now we are at a stage where we're going beyond antivirus. So antivirus systems usually are signature based. They look at signature of particular payload or an executable, examine it and see if there's a match. If there's no matching, it will not trigger. So now we move on into what we call the endpoint detection and response era. So in this era, what it does is instead of looking not only at the signatures, we're also looking at the indicators of attacks and indicators of compromise. So when we talk about indicators of attacks, it means before an attack happens, what are they trying to do? Are they trying to stop the antivirus system? Are they trying to scan the network for compromise? Are they looking for vulnerabilities in the environment? So all of this is being highlighted immediately using malware defense, if you see earlier, by EDR systems to prevent all these executables from being exploded into the environment. So this is the next stage where we are using EDRs to actually stop all these threats from happening by looking for indicators of compromise and indicators of attacks. So point number 9, we have limitation and control of network ports, protocols, and services. So if you think about it, in your network environment, you have servers, you have endpoints. What are the protocols they allow? What are the ports they allow and the services they allow within an enterprise environment? So the first thing that you probably will have is your web server. So if you have your web server and it's running on HTTPS, what kind of ports should be open up? And what kind of protocols should be allowed? TCP, UDP, and what about services? Are you allowing secure shell? Are you allowing outdated services like Telnet. Again, all of this has to be flagged out and be applied into the network security policies in your environment to actually limit all these potential threats in the environment. So anytime such services are being exploited, being scanned for, you must be able to flag them out immediately. Point number 10, data recovery capabilities. So when we're discussing about data recovery capabilities, if your enterprise suffers a cyber attack, if your enterprise goes into a continuous business continuity mode, what do you do to actually recover quickly? Do you have backup policies of your critical data? Do you have recovery policies for critical services? Are there services that cannot go down, that your users, your customers, your clients must always have access into them? You must have data recovery capabilities on them. So one example I can give you is for a financial institution. In a financial institution, you would have a lot of critical data around monetary values. And when that happens is that your systems are keeping all these virtual currencies and all these virtual values. The last thing you want is to lose these values and not be able to return those values back to your clients or back to your customers and your users. So the ability to recover is key to the survival of an enterprise. And if you look at some of the news lately and recently, a lot of mid-sized small companies or enterprises who suffer cyber attack are unable to recover from them because they got poor data recovery capabilities. And another great example that you can think about is in terms of ransomware. So when a ransomware encrypts critical data in your enterprise, what do you do? And are you still able to recover those critical data? So one of the methods that you can think about is to actually upload some of this critical data or all this critical data regularly into a cloud provider so that you have constant access, continuous access into them. Of course, this will bring out to the next question of how do you then protect your critical data on a cloud. Point 11, so we got secure configuration for network devices such as firewall, routers, and switches. So in the past couple of tutorials, you can actually learn about network intrusion prevention systems using Snort. So again, when you're configuring firewalls, routers, and switches, it's not just about the firewall policies, but it's also about the dominant accounts, the default usernames and passwords that's there, and then mapping back to your security policies in the enterprise. What kind of services are allowed? What kind of ports are allowed? What kind of direction are the ports open up for? Is it one way? Is it bi-directional? And how can you ensure that you're mapping all of your firewalls, routers, and switches to your security policies and limitations that you set forth earlier so that you continuously update and keep your network switches, firewalls, routers be updated regularly according to the network topology that you set for it, as well as the security policies of the services that are allowed. So one example you can think about is if in subnetwork A, you have a secure shell open up, but for subnetwork B, no secure shell is allowed, then does your firewall on the second subnetwork actually have those firewall policy to disable secure shell? So again, you probably have hundreds of subnetworks, tens of thousands of machines to manage, and in some cases in your offices, you have a lot of access points. Again, how do you manage the security configurations across all of them? So there are platforms and technology out there that allows you to single-handedly control all of these network policies with a single push through a platform. So you can then segregate the different kind of policies for each of the subnetwork depending on the sensitivity level of those networks. Item number 12 is on boundary defense. So boundary defense is fairly similar to the earlier point that you saw earlier. So what we can see here in boundary defense is what are the firewalls, large firewalls, core firewalls that you've put at the boundaries, what are the gateways that you've put at the boundaries, and how do you manage the VPN connection coming into the environment, and how do you segregate the network such that there is perhaps no ingress or no egress of data. So it could be one-way traffic from outside in, but no traffic from inside out. So again, all these policies are part of your boundary defense. So you line up the boundaries, and then you have sub-boundaries. Sub-boundaries that are put forward within the sub-networks where sensitivity of the objects, meaning you have critical data like personally identifiable information, critical information and data, and that you're not able to pull all this data out into another subnetwork or out into the internet. So again, these are key points where you want to have layered defense, boundary defense, protecting all of this key data. So item number 3, data protection. So data protection comes in many forms. And in terms of data protection, you want to have integrity, you want to have encryption, you want to have data loss prevention techniques to actually protect your critical data. So critical data you can think of as immediately financial data, personally identifiable information, and trade secrets, intellectual property. How are you protecting them? How are you ensuring that there are data classification first? That means you're able to discover where are your data, and then you're able to classify them, meaning are they top secret, secret, unclassified, public, and of course, all this information, how do you classify them? Does your users know how to classify them? And does your technology platform in place to actually manage and control, identify all this information and be able to put in encryption, integrity protection, meaning you can check the checksums value of the files or the systems and making sure that no unauthorized changes to them. If there are changes to them, are you logging them back into your security monitoring or your audit log analysis that you saw on the earlier points? So again, all of these points that you're seeing actually have to work hand in hand so that you can holistically be able to manage all the data security lifecycle across the enterprise. Item number 4, so control access based on the need to know. So this is really key and critical in terms of how you want to manage who can access what. So when a user is authenticated into the environment, every user has a different role. So if I'm from human resource, technically I should not be accessing financial information. And if I am from finance department, I should not be accessing certain sensitive objects from other departments. So again, you have to specify the roles of your users, what kind of sensitive level they are in and what kind of objects they can access into. So you have to group them based on the need to know. And what happens in a lot of enterprises is that there is privilege creep. Privilege creep meaning that users who have been in the enterprise for long enough, they have accesses to all projects and they have accesses to all system, network attached storage, and they get more and more accesses and privileges in an environment, accessing more key data. So a controlled access based on the need to know is key because it allows you to ensure that each user with their specific role, they can only access specific data and specific information. So with this hygiene, looking at the earlier point, using technology, you can actually manage which user is supposed to be authenticated to which subdirectory of the network attached storage. And of course, if you have content management system, you have knowledge-based system, how do you control and manage the accesses of all these users with different roles in the environment? And as they change role, how do you update their privileges and entitlements? Number 15 is wireless access control. So can you have a token within each of your laptops, mobile devices as they connect to the intranet? And of course, are you segregating visitor accesses into the wireless network in your environment, having segregation of network so that you're able to control what users are coming in? So again, it goes back to the earlier point. Can you have segregation of wireless access points? So if a user from a particular region like Singapore and is going to another part of the world, but he's going there for holiday, not for work, and when he accesses the intranet over in another region, in another continent, is he still allowed the same accesses? Can he access the servers outside of his origin office? Again, all these are key questions to really think about. And when you think about wireless access control, what kind of security policies are you using? Are you still using the outdated WEP or have you already used WPA? And are you using radius or using diameter? So again, all these are key points about how you want to control the devices that you're accessing into your environment and whether you have max security in place to ensure that the machines that have authorized have accesses to your access points. And of course, account monitoring control. So again, I want to highlight how are users accessing, how are they authenticated, do you have two-factor authentication? If a user has an account that's compromised outside of the enterprise using the same password, will the hacker from another part of the world still be able to copy the username, copy the password, and be able to access directly into your systems outside? So again, these are key things that you want to look out for. And on the dark web, there are billions of usernames and passwords that's readily available. You can just copy and paste them, and immediately you'll be able to look at all the accounts. So can you introduce multi-factor authentication? Can you introduce two-factor authentication? Be able to use fingerprint, be able to use biometric authentication to further the authorization and authentication of the users, and then at the same time be able to audit down all of the information the users are doing. So in some examples that I can give is super users, administrators have shared accounts. So when they have shared accounts, what they do is that you have administrator A and administrator B, and both of them are using the same super user account. So again, this defeats the purpose of being able to track what users are doing, and it defeats the purpose of non-repudiation. So they're able to repute themselves from actually being accessing or doing certain changes to critical systems and data. So point number 17. So now we're going into a different area. So implementing a security awareness and training program is key, because a lot of this technology are complex, they're complicated to manage, they're really challenging, especially as your enterprise scale into the hundreds of thousands of machines, endpoints, and servers. So a security awareness and training program ensure that your users, you're covering the people, process, technology, you're specifically covering the people part. So when covering the people part, what happened is that you're able to actually ensure the users do not click a malicious link. They're able to classify data, meaning whether data is top secret, confidential, or publicly available to users, while at the same time you're managing the process as well as the technology. So people is not just about cybersecurity awareness training, but it's also about letting them learn about data security, data classification, what links not to click, and so on. So all these are really critical, especially social engineering, which has been around for decades, for hundreds of years, is still working fantastic. How you're able to identify those loopholes. If a hacker goes into the physical security end, they enter into the office, look at confidential files, confidential items that are being printed out of the printer. Are you able to manage the physical security on top of that as well? And if a user was to get a call from help desk asking for their password so that they can fix their machine or their accesses, are your users able to identify that this is actually a malicious call? So again, all these trainings has to be continuous, it has to be constant, and the messaging has to be aligned all the time. Again, mapping back to the IT security strategy and the overall business strategy of the enterprise. So we got application software security. So there are more and more devices that are being created across the internet, and there are a lot of services available through API calls and a lot of applications like mobile apps, web browser apps. How are you protecting the application layer? How are you ensuring that if you were to buy a software off the shelf, they have no vulnerability? And if you're building a bespoke application like an enterprise resource planning system, how do you make sure that you're testing all these applications prior to deploying them out into the public? So these are key abilities, because a lot of these websites are constantly scanned. And if you've been following the channel, there are a lot of tutorials that I've shown earlier that can actually hack directly into all these systems and be able to take out and extract a lot of key data automatically. So a lot of these forms in your web browsers, your mobile application servers that have APIs open up, you have to constantly be testing them, making sure that from the source code to a secure code review, secure code design, all the way to deploying the software onto the publicly available internet are constantly secured through a secure development life cycle. And incident response and management on number 19. So despite all of the efforts for the past 20 years that enterprises have introduced to prevent and to detect attacks, there are still a lot of attacks that went through. So what happened is that if an attack was to occur right now, what do you do? If a ransomware occurs right now in your enterprise, what do you do? So this is what we call the playbooks, the incident response and management. How do you contain and remediate against all sorts of different cyber attacks? A SQL injection is largely very different from a ransomware outbreak. So with this in mind, if a SQL injection was to happen, what are the step-by-step activities that you can introduce into the enterprise so that you'll be able to mitigate against that attack? And then of course, if there is cross-site scripting, what are the activities that you can introduce through a playbook? And with all this incident response plan in place, you have a activities for each of those components, each of those potential attacks. And then you have components where you can assign to people. You have phone numbers, you have email addresses, you have contact points where you can assign and you can track the response and the containment and remediation speed against those cyber threats. And finally, we got penetration tests and red team exercises. So now that you've put in all of your defense in place, all of the Center for Internet Security's critical security controls, now you got to test them. You got to make sure that your blue team is working well, and you have to conduct a lot of red team exercises. So what happened is that you have your penetration testers going in. They are scanning the network for potential vulnerabilities. They are looking for misconfiguration, looking for dominant accounts, using social engineering to send phishing emails into your employees, and all of these different myriad ways of attacks. And if you look through the whole channel so far and all of the technical tutorials that we went through, you will recognize that attacks are actually a lot easier than defense. And if you think about it critically, all you need is to find a single vulnerability to exploit and you're in the enterprise environment. However, for defense, you have to make sure that you have thousands of configurations all set right. So this is the part where it's a continuous process. The red team, the penetration testing, has continuously gelled back with the blue team. So when you're conducting all this penetration testing, red team exercises, you have to continuously feedback to the blue team or the defending team about how they can better the security posture, how they can better their security environment, how they can improve their social engineering. So if you have users who still continuously click on the malicious links, then you have to up your ante in terms of your security awareness training. If you have misconfigurations on the network layer, you have to work with the network team to ensure that the configurations are properly pushed out into all of the network switches, firewalls, network intrusion prevention systems. So to summarize today's lecture, we have went through all of the basic, foundational, as well as organization. So all in all of these security controls have to work hand in hand together so that you holistically be able to defend your enterprise against potential cyber threats. Whether now you're looking at continuous vulnerability management, all the way to security awareness and training program, all of them have to run concurrently and you have to prioritize your efforts. So every time you do a red team exercise, they would actually expose you to where are the areas where you actually need to improve the efforts and prioritize them so that you have better defense against potential advanced threats. So that when a real attack occurs, you are able to defend your enterprise, defend yourself, and defend all of your crown jewels. So with that, we come to the end of the lecture today. If you have any questions, leave a comment below. If you like what you watch, remember to like the video, share the video, and subscribe to the channel so that you can be kept abreast of the latest cybersecurity tutorials.